Well, I have the immense pleasure today of both first introducing and then having a conversation with Youssef Rakha. I'm going to get through the preliminary bio as quickly as possible so we can get into, hopefully, an interesting conversation. Youssef Rakha is the son of a formerly Marxist lawyer, Al-Said Rakha. He's from Doki, a neighborhood in Cairo that some of you may be acquainted with. He graduated with a BA in English and philosophy from Hull University in 1998. He began working for Al-Ahram Weekly, the Cairo-based English language newspaper, in 1999. Since then, he's worn many hats. He's a poet, photographer, a supporter of other writers, and a novelist himself, also a photo essayist. He has a photo essay called Beirut Shi Mahal. That's quite incredible, and was already well known, but became extremely well known for his book, The Book of the Sultan's Seal: Strange Incidents from History in the City of Mars, published in 2011. To try to describe the book would be almost impossible. It's a kind of a book that blends history and the present, fiction and fantasy and reality, and experiments heavily with form. And he also has the book The Crocodiles, which was released in 2011. Crocodiles was released in 2017, if I'm not mistaken, and other books like Paula, which both books, the Crocodiles is kind of a book written almost in a kind of poetic form where each section is numbered, and it deals with the world of poetry in Cairo in the 1990s, whereas The Sultan's Seal is a book written in the form of a letter, which is kind of a traditional Arabic literary form, if you will, quasi-literary form. And that book deals with, in a way, with the aftermath of the January 2011 revolution that happened in Cairo. So I'm going to start by kind of asking a question that might be simple, but is actually a bit more complex, which is where you're from. And by that, Youssef, I don't mean Egypt. You talk about in your interviews this idea that communities that, for example, have internet and live on the internet might have more in common with places that are in the same geographic region. So worlds are not really a question solely of geography. Many of us grow up in an American culture, even if we grow up abroad. And so there's a plurality of worlds that one can live in and one can grow up in and experience, even if they grew up in one geographic location. But then the kind of corollary of that is that the expectation of especially in the West, when work is translated to English, the expectation is that there's this idea of diversity wherein a cultural representative comes in from some part of the world and then represents that culture in a certain framework to have this idea of diversity for this kind of consumer in the West who is able to sample cultures and get these exemplars of different cultures and mindsets from around the world, when actually the real reality is far more amorphous and intersecting than these kind of neat boxes. So I was interested in kind of not only the idea of where you're from, and not as a question of geography, but also how does that idea of where you're from interact with this overarching culture that exists in the world and the expectations of this global market. Because you say one thing very interesting, which is that you don't sit down and try to, prove a stereotype wrong or incorrect, but rather your work, by negating that from the very beginning and by being somewhat of whatever the word would mean, an honest expression, kind of negates that or negates that kind of mindset from the beginning, that idea of the false representation. So I'm curious how you might expand on that.
Right. Well, hello, and thanks for being here. So this is there are different ways I can answer this question. I mean, there are many different levels. But one of them, I would say, is this idea of which I've been concerned with for a long time, this idea of being contemporary and what it means to be contemporary. And I wasn't aware of this until relatively recently, but in a lot of sort of French post-Marxist theory, the notion of the contemporary doesn't actually just mean of the present time or at present, and this kind of solved the problem that I had, because if you think of contemporary as of this time, then that would include all kinds of things that I don't think of as contemporary in my conception of contemporary. But but according to these theories, you can also think of contemporary as a position that is aware of past and present. It isn't it does it, you are in a specific time frame, but you're aware of what's coming, of the possibilities, and of where this time frame, how this time frame was formed in history. So I would definitely say that I am from a contemporary space in this sense, but it's also a contemporary space that's conditioned by being from this part of the world, and this is not something that I chose, but it's also not something that I chose not to be. So and this is, I think this is where your question becomes really interesting, because uh, choosing and choosing against are sort of proactive interventions that condition and mold an identity in a specific way, and obviously in the framework of an extremely sort of hyper consumerist culture that deals with cultural products as products, you know, things like literature and novels and so on, as they want to label these things and market them and kind of shelf them, and they also want them to cover certain quotas, and you know they want them to solve sort of identity politics problems within American society that don't necessarily exist elsewhere, you know. So you want a novel by somebody whose sexual orientation is X, Y, and Z, or whose race is X, Y, and Z, and so on, and you're somehow expected to. I mean, there are different levels of that, obviously, but once you address a global market, you're somehow expected to contribute to these processes, which is not something that I'm interested in doing, and not something that I have been doing, and that can result in feelings of being left out, or a sense of being on the margins of things. But the way I make up for that, I mean, you asked about a number of things, but partly the reason that I've got a platform of my own is to create a global community, kind of alongside everything else that exists, and that can be extremely inspiring. I mean, maybe we can talk a little bit about that later on. But
Yeah.
so there's the work on part of the work is also trying to generate a context for what I do and who I do it in relation to, and trying to find alternatives to the sort of the mainstream money regulated channels that are centered in the West, but are also increasingly. I mean, you might be surprised to know that they have been imported more or less. So like the publishing industry, for example, in the Arab world is now far more like the publishing industry, the kind of hyper commercialized, money driven publishing industry of the West than it was maybe 10, or I mean even within my lifetime. So this is not something that you can really avoid. It's something that you have to confront and you have to negotiate with. Yeah, I don't know. I feel I've digressed.
No. I mean, that you were speaking about the kind of platform that you helped create to kind of foster a different kind of audience or different kind of reception. You were talking about that's the Sultan Seal, the coolest hotel, Cairo's coolest.
Yeah, Cairo's coolest cosmopolitan hotel. Yes.
So that leads me to my second kind of question, which is more about form, which is this idea of. I'm going to circle back to the website, but
sure.
I'm going to start by talking about this idea that. So you mentioned two things early in this interview that I was reading with Hilary Plum, and you say that in this music and literature, and you say that the Eurocentric ethos is no longer particularly European, which we kind of addressed. It's kind of global form now, and it can be embodied by someone outside of Europe. It's not geographically located at all. and it's all encompassing to some degree. And then you also write, and though rife with death of the novel discourse, it's actually, everything is still irrevocably novel bound. I'm curious as to, I mean, what does it mean to use, to write in the novel form, which is a 19th century form, and has, if we're speaking about what's proper to the novel, it's kind of, it's a monastic form of writing. It has a hermetic value. It's a way of enclosing yourself off from the world, engaging in a story. But so to what extent does your, to what extent do you, what do you hope to achieve by opting for the novel as a form? And when you're, what does it mean to use this 19th century format in the 21st century? And what dictates what kind of form you use, both when you're writing novels? So are your novels meant to be read silently on a park bench? Are they meant to be shouted, screamed, sung? Are they kind of, there's an orality to them, like poetry in Arabic, which you talk about also. So on what modular level should we interact with your novels, or can one interact? Let's not say should, but then also at what point, what dictates which kind of form you use? What will make you dictate, okay, this is going to be a photo journal like Beirut Shimahal, or this calls for the creation of featuring other voices besides my own, or pushing other voices to the forefront. This calls for poetry written in the heat of the moment. This calls for articles written in a newspaper. This calls for nonfiction, et cetera, et cetera. So both, what makes you use the novel? What are the different registers that operate within your novel? And what dictates when you use certain forms, including not only forms proper to you, but the form in the sense of curation, right?
Right,
and
right.
Other voices, which is what you're talking about with the website. So how can, it's again, a sprawl of questions that tries to have some sort of unity, but.
So with the novel, I mean, I just want to make a quick comment about the Eurocentric ethos, and what I've noted, I mean, what I've learned since that interview, which was quite a few years back, is that, I mean, despite that, and despite the fact that I might feel a completely seamless part of this sort of pseudo-global Eurocentric or Eurocentric-inspired literary ethos, I'm actually excluded by virtue of where I come from, and in a way that somebody who's actually from Europe or from the States is not. And this has been a somewhat disappointing and frustrating thing to realize, that the institutional frameworks and even the media frameworks and assumptions and so on, they do not accept me as an Arab in the way that they would accept somebody from elsewhere in the world. And that is extremely frustrating. But it also, what it's been teaching me is that the contexts that I work on creating, the places that I work on sort of setting up for what I do and for what others like me do, are as important as the institutional places that already exist, you know. So without kind of entirely giving up on the world, on the sort of mainstream world, you know, we should always be seeking alternatives. So this, just to get this out of the way, because I feel that what I say in the interview is slightly misleading regarding how I feel now. You know, at the time I was a little more optimistic maybe, but yeah. So the novel is a very complex thing, because also in Arabic it's even more recent than. So it's the most recent literary form, and it's really associated with the middle class. It's not just hermetic, and it's not just about being in a room by yourself, but it's also about a professional class and a society that kind of endorses this professional class. And that happened in the Arab world somewhat later than in Europe and in places where the novel originated. So it's a very recent, it's a very young form in Arabic, and when I started when I went back to writing in the mid 2000s, there was actually this thing where the late Gabr Asfour, who's a very well-known academic critic, literary critic in Egypt, had declared something called the age of the novel, and where everybody who wanted to write anything that wasn't obviously poetry would label it novel. So people would write, extended short stories or prose poems or a memoir or whatever, and would put the word novel on them because that was the quickest way to get them read and to run for prizes and so on and so forth. So I was actually against the idea of the novel. I was really opposed to the novel, and that's why for the longest time I was only writing literary nonfiction, which was this sort of place-oriented travel writing. But then when it came to Cairo, when it was Cairo's turn, I couldn't really do it with a straight face. I mean, I couldn't just write an essay or even an extended essay about Cairo. I had to invent something. I had to come up with a fantastical framework for approaching this thing that was, too close and too present. So. I'm sorry about the background noises, by the way. But this is Cairo. You're getting a
Precisely.
Getting a sense of place. So it wasn't actually. I mean, the novel for me. The novel is the traditional kind of 19th century novel is one format, one model, among others that I'm in conversation with, and especially in the book of the Sultan's Seal. It wasn't really. It was just a framework that existed alongside other sort of mainly traditional canonical sort of Arab sources to work on this idea of identity and what it means to be from here now, which kind of connects with your first question, and it shared with the novel this notion that there is a kind of a plot line. There's a story that carries the book from beginning to end, which is not, say, the case with a canonical book of Arabic prose, where there is no one line. I mean, there can be a theme. There often is a theme that connects everything, but not a storyline, not a narrative. And I was kind of trying to connect the two. So I was trying to make every chapter its own kind of monograph, its own almost like study on a theme. That's also enjoyable, but to make it so that all the chapters taken together will still tell a connected, coherent story, and that's how I kind of conversed with the novel. I don't know if I'm as interested in this question of form as I was then. At the time, it was a very pressing question for me, partly because of the discourse. I mean, partly because of this whole idea of this is the age of the novel. Everyone's writing novels, etc., etc. But right now I'm really far more relaxed about this, and I mean I've always written in a variety of forms and across sort of genres, if you like. So. But now I think I know the kinds of things that I want to do in writing, and it doesn't really. I mean, form is really an afterthought in the sense that form has more to do with packaging and presenting the work than it really has to do with the writing itself, with the substance or the sort of the meat of what I'm doing itself. But the benefit of the novel label or the novel format is that you can have all of these things together in one book. Is that you can have a variety of things within one book, and it admits of that, this idea of polyphony in ways that maybe a book of poetry or a book of essays doesn't, or it does to a lesser extent. So when you say, do I want you to read in silence or to shout or to sing? I mean, I would say all of the above, definitely, because definitely in a novel, I would aim for all of the above and some other things too, because it's usually, for me, it's usually a very long-term, very serious project that by the time you're done with it as a writer or as a reader, you feel you've accomplished something. It isn't just it isn't like a quick read or a singular sort of casual experience. It's a commitment. Like a novel is a commitment to me, and so I would attempt to include all of these things, I would attempt to include some lyricism and some polemics even in some way. But yeah,
sorry, continue.
But yeah, no, I was just going to say it doesn't really matter what you're going to call it, and it's hybrid anyway. It's hybrid, and it's post novel anyway. I mean, the novel that I'm going to write is post novel by definition, right? But it's also hybrid and post, in the sense that it's being written. I mean, in the case of the novels you've mentioned, it's being written in Arabic and from here. And still in conversation or in contact with a culture that I've come to see doesn't really see it as much as it sees that culture, and that's an interesting thing also. But yeah, so yeah.
Well, you mentioned Arabic, which is a good segue into my third question, which has to do with the use of language, which is something that both is part of your work, but you've also spoken about in your work directly. I mean, you begin the book, The Sultan Seer, where you say, I worry that few people who don't read in Arabic. I don't blame them, which is a great way to start. But then you also speak of this idea of trying to build this wonderful phrase, a commonwealth of Egyptian Arabic, a kind of linguistic caliphate, multifarious and functional. So on the one hand, you have this objective where you're trying to liberate the Arabic language from, this kind of desperate croak of a creature on its last legs, which I can relate to when you hear it on the news or in religious contexts. But at the same time, one would imagine that when you're using certain forms of Arabic, you're also just using it as a natural expression of how we think. I mean, any Arab can relate to the idea of the dialect and the division between how they speak, which is naturally a hybrid dialectical language versus the kind of the nature of text. So yes, I'm interested in kind of how you play with language. To what extent is it a conscious experimentation? To what extent is it a reflection of life that by necessity must be experimental, given the norms of what it means to write in Arabic versus dialect, etc.
Yes, I mean, this last comment I think is very true, because we have this situation of diglossia. We don't speak the way we write really, and in some cases the dialects are so different that they're not even mutually intelligible. So if you go to Morocco or whatever, it becomes very, very difficult. And I started out, I mean, in my teens, in my sort of late teens and early 20s, I was very I had totally bought into this sort of vaguely Arabist, as in European Arabist idea that this is a form of backwardness, that we should really have gone the way of Europe and developed national languages along the lines of Latin vernaculars, and that this is just a way in which we're backward and we've held ourselves back, etc. But now, I mean, as I've grown up, I've come to realize it's just a different model of language functioning, and it doesn't have to be that way. And it's actually the benefits to it, the fact that we have this continuity in time and in space with the written language, which is also extremely, extremely variable. I mean, one of the things, like with the Book of the Sultan Seal, one of the main sources was Jaberti, who's this Cairene historian of the very early 19th, late 18th and very early 19th century. And he wrote in an extremely sort of vernacular, I mean, it's still standard Arabic, but it was very vernacular, very informal, etc. And then more recently, I was reading Mutanabbi, who's a Abbasi poet, like the Arab Shakespeare, who's from the, I guess, 10th century, and this is widely seen as the pinnacle of Arab rhetoric, and so on. And they're both standard Arabic, and they're both more or less intelligible to me, and it's the same language, but they're really completely different languages. I mean, it's just amazing. They're probably more different than say if you read the same text in Spanish and Italian. They would be more similar today than Jaberti and Mutanabbi, even though they're both standard Arabic. They're not even dialect. And so Arabic is this extremely rich thing that you really have to play with. And I find, and it's always amazed me how kind of contemporary writers can just write in Arabic and not even think about this the wealth and the depth and the variety of contained in this language, you know. So there's an element of experimentation that comes with that when I write in Arabic. I mean, sometimes I write in English, and then the experimentation goes elsewhere, or it becomes about something else. But in Arabic, there's always a huge component that has to do with the language itself. I mean, what is this language, and to what extent is it kind of abiding by norms, like writing norms, but also how is that connecting with the way people speak and language as it is lived? Because obviously I've always felt that, you know, the language of literature has to be alive, and alive means that it can be spoken. But if you're writing in a language that isn't spoken, that is almost never spoken, then you have to infuse it with that sort of vernacular life in one way or another, you know. And so there's that question. But also, I think the question, I mean, there's this beautiful Shahid Ali, you know, the Urdu, well, he wrote in English, but he's from Kashmir, poet, and he says, the only language of loss left in the world is Arabic. And I feel that's such a poignant thing for me, because it's also, I mean, even though there is an increasingly sort of active and busy scene where people pretend to be accomplished sort of writers with wide readerships, and, you know, in the consumerist and capitalist modes of the West. I think that writing in Arabic is really, in a lot of ways, a gesture of an almost heroic gesture in this day and age, you know, and almost a very
it cut an almost what gesture?
An almost heroic gesture, something very poignant, because you're really sort of affirming the continuity of something that is undermined and dysfunctional in so many ways. I mean, it really is dysfunctional in a lot of ways. And I think the project of the Arab writer, for me, as at least, has to do with kind of breathing contemporary, again, to come back to this idea of contemporary, breathing contemporary life into a medium that has been misused and sort of neglected in a lot of ways for many decades, if not centuries, you know. So this is about Arabic. I don't know. I think your question had a separate component about language, which is a different. I mean, we could talk about that as well if you like, but I don't know how are we doing with time.
We have a little bit of time. I think we have time for at least one more question.
Sure.
So I'm changing gears slightly away from language and form, or maybe not. So you speak about this idea of that, okay, that books is back to that question of representation also. It's that they don't have this functionless purpose where there's this, I hate always the question, and especially I'm asked a lot within my own work as a filmmaker, okay, what's the message?
Yeah.
Right? What's if there was a message, I just tell you the message. Why would you go and watch the movie? I could just write it down for you. The message is X. But you say, but you offer as an antidote to that. Okay, the work should be about something, but doesn't have to have this message. But you have this really beautiful. I'm gonna read literally what you say. You say, but what a work could do. You do it to orchestrate, assumingly right, what it is about this world that hurts you. And the orchestration, however extravagant or artificial on the surface, has to show how, by hurting you and despite you, the world has turned you into a meaningful human proposition, a unique repository of consciousness, and a voice capable of making someone else laugh and cry. I mean, can anyone on earth or in heaven aspire to being more than that? So this idea that a work has to not just make you vulnerable, but really hurt you. But then that's also, I'm wondering if it's tied to this idea of post-despair that has been assigned to you, that you've assigned to yourself. And you also have another quote, much shorter, where you say, linked to this idea of post-despair, hope is an elastic thing. If you keep clinging to it, you don't get anywhere. I cast it aside and carried on. So I think that's from Sultan's Seal, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
Okay. So what is this proposition that work has to necessarily hurt you? What does it mean to be in a moment? My electricity cut, Lebanon, hopefully we're okay.
Oh.
What does it mean to be in this moment of post-despair, and how is that different, if it is different from the question of nihilism?
Well, I mean, I think all of literature, in some sense, all of literature is post-despair, in the sense that I don't think literature is about kind of trying to improve the world, or using language to improve the world in the way that activism, say, is. And I think in at the present moment, there's a lot of confusion between sort of activism discourse and literature, or creative discourse, creative uses of language, which is partly why, as you say, you keep getting asked about the question, about the message. And it's also a requirement sometimes to, so if you want to publish a book, or if you want to get a grant or something, you really have to answer to some kind of agenda. You know, even if you agree with that agenda, that's not really what the work is about. I mean, the work is about. So in this sense, it's supposed to despair, in the sense that you've given up on changing the world as such, and you're speaking, you're beginning from a point after you've given up. You're not hoping to contribute to the process of changing the world or improving things by speaking, or by making this artistic contribution, right? But also, it's obviously post-despair in the sense that you know, I mean, I guess it was already post-despair when I wrote the Sultan Seal, but definitely after the Arab Spring, it's post-despair in the sense that there was a moment of hope, there was a collective moment of very genuine sort of promise, and it came to nothing, or it came to worse, you know. So but that seems to be a recurrent theme in our part of the world, and I think it's just the historical juncture that we're going through. I mean, I think it's probably like a few hundred years ago and a few hundred years to come. It's not something that's going to change in our lifetime. So there's despair in this sense, despair that the reality in which you exist, in which you operate, is unjust and limiting, and et cetera, and that this, and we don't really have the means to change that, or to do anything about that. And this is also the place where you write from. So this is to answer the post-despair part. The vulnerability part, which is absolutely essential, crucial to me, is so there's a huge amount of literature in the world, and a lot of it is very good. But what how can you sort of stand out, or what makes it worth it? What makes a particular text different or important? And I think, I mean, for me, a very large part of the answer to that question has to do with the capacity of the writer to make themselves vulnerable to the very things that presumably drove the writing, which cannot be sort of objective concerns or curiosity, and produce something powerful. I mean, they have to be. You have to have felt the horror and the pain and the grief of being human, of being mortal, of being on Earth, you know, and the work has to be a response to that. I mean, I'm not saying that this has to be explicit or in any way codified, but I think it has to be there. And I think that the connection that it makes with somebody else has to do with that more than anything else. It has to do with that more than technical prowess, and more than formal excellence, and more than erudition, and more. I mean, anything else that you can praise about a given text is less important than this capacity of sort of really exposing yourself, exposing something truly vulnerable in yourself, in your situation. and so making it possible for the reader to sense that in themselves too, and to be okay about it. And I think that this is the way in which literature should hurt you, which again, with the advent of sort of, sensitivity readers and trigger warnings and things like that in the last few years, is making it more difficult, because I really think that literature is about being offended and being hurt and being and then sort of connecting with that and making peace with that and making sense of the world through that. And if you're going to worry about offending people or not saying the right things within the text, or sort of triggering emotional responses in people, etc., that's not, you're not going to be able to do that. You're going to, you're going to impose all kinds of censorship on your creative process that will impede this if you like, vulnerability formation. I just thought of this expression. It's so if you're forming vulnerability growth, yeah. So this is very important to me, and I think it'll remain important. This is something that kind of exists across genres and across writing practices. This idea that you should be able to expose yourself, and in so doing expose the reader, and that this is what makes it worth it, in a way that good writing in itself doesn't.
Mm. Yeah, I sense that in your work, or I read that in the work. I'll bet I was reading a lot of it in English, but there was this incredible rawness and honesty and sometimes simplicity of phrase that felt very direct and very crucial. Like that, I think, in my mind, the mark of a good writing is when somebody says something that appears as though it's obvious, but you've never actually heard it before. You've never realized it before,
right.
but you feel like you should have realized it all along. And that happens a lot in your prose. But then at the same time, when one zooms out, the writing becomes more symbolic and kind of becomes a bit talismanic. You have this beautiful description of Cairo. I could read the whole thing where you talk about how the details of the maps of the city, how the city looks from an aerial point of view, and how detailed and clear each of the avenues is. But then as it fades out, it becomes this kind of structure that is almost, hazy in its power. And I felt the same way with your writing. When you're reading it, it's very detailed, very clear, it's like it's right in front of you. And it has this raw kind of honesty that doesn't need to apply to something else or be compared to. It's a self-evident honesty that's in the work as you're reading it. But then at the same time, there's a kind of abstracting effect that has its own power, metaphorical, symbolic power, when the work is taken as a whole, away from the act of the specific passages themselves, when it looks at the entire form. So I found that description you have of Cairo to almost be symbolic of your writing itself. But yeah, so that way that you can blend the kind of style.
That's extremely flattering, Malik. Thank you. That's really good to know.
Yeah, definitely. And the blending of stylism on the one hand with that kind of raw wisdom that kind of should be something that's cliche, but you've never heard it before, actually. So it's kind of that's what's kind of incredible. Or not cliche, but something you should have known, but you actually had never thought of it before. So that's great. I think now might be as good a time as any. Before we go to the Q&A, there's a series of round robin, almost like round robin type questions. So the first one is kind of who would you find, if you had to pick one person? Well, let's start with this. First of all, what have people understood or misunderstood most about your work? I think that was one of the questions. Like, what is something people get, and what is some people always never seem to get about your work?
Well, I think I would say, well, there's one answer to both questions, and I guess my work is often interpreted or described as difficult or sort of, it has been called elitist or complex or whatever, and I think in some sense that may be true, in the sense that I do try to complicate things to achieve more than one thing at once. So as you say, to make, as much as I want the text to be engaging, I am doing something else with the text at a different level. so that once you've sort of stepped back, you can see a different image or thing going on. But it's also completely a complete misunderstanding in the sense that I never set out to. I mean, I'm not elitist in this sense. I'm actually. I mean, I a lot of what I do is sets out to counter this idea that literature is the obscure preserve of a few erudite people, but without necessarily giving up what literature is. I mean, I think there's a huge difference between doing something other than literature and sort of making literature accessible. And I think that the drive to accessibility, which has been linked to the drive for sales, is potentially extremely corrupting and makes things like takes the essence of things out of them and makes them far less interesting than they could be. And so I don't want to do that. But at the same time, I don't think of myself as this sort of ivory tower, complex, difficult writer at all, And if there's a level of difficulty, then that's because it has to be there. It's not something that I impose on the work or set out to create.
Okay, great. I think we're running short on time, and it would be cruel to the audience not to take some questions from the audience.
Okay.
But I know that here we go. This is what we can do this very quickly. We can do these kinds of rapid fire.
Okay.
So what are you reading, watching right now?
I haven't been watching. I'd really like to be watching, but I'm reading Monsieur Pain by Roberto Bolaño, which I'd read a few years ago in English, and now I'm reading it in Spanish because I have just about enough Spanish to actually make it out, and it's wonderful. So yeah.
Okay, great. So who would you love to shadow for a day? Past.
Okay, so I thought of that. I'd love to shadow Abdurrahman al-Jabarti for one of the days when he went to visit the French scientists of Bonaparte's expedition and got really fascinated with all the trinkets and the laboratory paraphernalia that he saw there.
Right. What do people? We did that, and then the final question: whose work do you admire and are inspired by?
Oh, there are loads of people, but I'm going to mention Sargon Boulos, who I discovered relatively late in, I think it was 2008, and I hadn't heard of, and he's always been a tremendous inspiration. So Sargon is this Iraqi poet who was based in San Francisco for most of his life, and actually died in Berlin quite recently. And he wasn't very well known in the Arab world or even elsewhere, and he still isn't. But I mean, I do as much as I can to kind of spread the word about him, because I really think he's great. But yeah.
Okay. How did you come up with the name Mustafa Shorbagy, I guess?
Shorbagy, yeah.
In Arabic, Turkish Arabic, as well as using titles for his chapters, the epistle on, the kitab on, the kitab of, and the Sultan's seal. She thought that was absolutely superb. So she wanted to know how both the name.
The name Mustafa was a reference to the Prophet because there's a kind of a very esoteric, under the surface connection with the story of the Prophet Muhammad. So Mustafa is a reference to that, and also because he's chosen. Mustafa means chosen, so he's chosen by the Khalifa, by the Sultan to perform this task or whatever. And Shorbagy is actually interesting because Shorbagy is a common surname in Egypt that I discovered. What it actually meant in Turkish was the head of a janissary corps, who and the reason is called Shorbagy is that he carried the container, the soup container, the shorba container, to feed soldiers, the janissaries. So obviously because of the Ottoman connection and the fact that he's being enlisted by the Ottoman Sultan, whatever, it should have made sense that he be called that. And the chapter titles was just yeah, that was these were more or less direct riffs on canonical texts that I was inspired by and sort of in conversation with while I was writing. So each chapter is supposed to be modeled on or like a miniature version of some kind of canonical text or genre of text, and this is where the titles came from.
Okay. Next question is from Jackie Salzinger. Thank you so much for your reflections. I'm part of a research project by Professor Safwan Masri that's interested in Arab identity and the limits of using an Arabist region-wide framework to understand lives and experiences, even events in Arab-identified contexts today. Your remarks about the lack of linguistic unity, even standard Arabic, really caught my attention, though also the shared experience you note of navigating dialect plus binaries. I was wondering if you could offer any more reflections on the relationship between the Arabic language, and Arab identity in the region today. So kind of expanding on those points about language, but maybe tying them into a question of to what extent can we speak of a sociolinguistic?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the state of the language reflects, I mean, without wanting to say that that the only option or the only thing that could have happened is the Arab world going the way of Latin, you know, and I mean that didn't happen, and I'm actually glad that didn't happen. But I think the state of Arabic now is really very much a reflection on of the state of Arabness, in the sense that it's I mean some of it is extremely stilted and sort of almost fossilized. Some of it is extremely sort of medievalist in perspective. I mean, that doesn't actually mean it's medieval. It just means that it thinks it's medieval, or it thinks it's from the past, but it isn't actually from the past. It's just right. Kind of. There was this brilliant article on the fact that the ISIS flag was actually a hoax. It never. Right. I mean, they think that this comes from the past. It doesn't. You know, it was made up. But also the fact that we have this extremely decadent, extremely fluid spoken language in the dialects, you know, and I think across the whole of the Mashriq now, so Egypt maybe up to Libya, and all the way to the Iraq border, you know, I think that's more or less one sort of dialect continuum. That's extremely complex and extremely fluid and constantly changing, whatever. And that's a reflection of the chaos, you know, of the fact that, you know, that we don't have order in our lives, definitely not in our collective lives. So I think that would be an interesting research project in itself to kind of describe the language landscape with reference to sort of social political reality, you know, and how features of the language and the way it works actually reflects features of social political reality. But I mean, I just want to say I don't love it any less for all that, you know. Arabic, I think it's I still think it's wonderful, you know.
Yeah, and its messiness, and it's not the dialect. It's not simply a question of geography. It's also a question of there are certain Bedouin dialects that are transnational. That
absolutely, yeah.
It's not simply Lebanese dialect and Syrian dialect. It's way more complicated than that. Okay, so we have time, hopefully, for at least certainly one, maybe two more questions if we're lucky. So does Reem have another? Is it that Reem has another question? Or let me see. So we have Reem's question, Jackie's question. The numbering of the paragraphs in Crocodiles, how does that, you numbered your, I'm going to give you two actually in the place of one, since we're running out of time. So you have how did Reem is asking again, not only about the titles in Sultan's Seal, but the numbers, the choice of the numbers in the ordering of the crocodile. And then another question is, the importance of Allen Ginsberg, how and why, to you and to your writing. So.
Okay. The numbering of I don't really know what to say about the numbering of the paragraphs. I mean, I wanted a format that would. I wanted to work in discrete entities so that each paragraph or each bit, rather than a chapter that's made up of paragraphs, I wanted to work in almost like prose poems, in the form of like each chapter, each paragraph would be its own sort of standalone prose poem. And the way to connect these, one of the ways to connect these, partly in a very sort of roundabout way, inspired by Wittgenstein, which I read at university and which was a huge influence at the time. But I mean, obviously nothing to do with the Crocodiles itself, but just the format was to use numbers. And I did that with a nonfiction essay as well more recently. So it's a format I'd like to work in, and people have very extreme reactions to it. Some people love it, some people hate it. But yeah, Allen Ginsberg. I wouldn't say Allen Ginsberg as a figure is particularly important to my work, but there are a few poems that I found very inspiring. And the idea with the Crocodiles is that the whole beat phenomenon seemed extremely relevant to the 90s generation experience, which I was talking about. So it was an interesting sort of thing to compare with, like an interesting light to throw on what happened in Egypt in the 90s, poetry-wise, what was happening in America in the 50s, I guess. And not to say that it was the same or even similar, but it was just equivalent in certain ways. And obviously some of Ginsberg's texts are very central to that, and very so I was trying to translate this particular poem that's in the Crocodiles, the line "for real," and so I made one of the characters try and translate it, and the text provides sort of alternative translations of it. And but Allen Ginsberg as such, I don't think is particularly central to my work.
Yeah, well, that's the interesting part of that role that you played, despite wanting to. Was it the cultural? You find yourself in the cultural exchange aisle of the global supermarket, or
yes.
It's a position that we might not want, but I think it comes with the territory. Unfortunately,
it's very difficult. It's a very difficult position to be in. But yes.
Well, that's hard, yeah. Well, so that's it. We are basically in the final minute of the hour time. I think we used it we filled it as much as one can hope to. Youssef, I really enjoyed the conversation. It was great. Thank you, Mikey. Thank you, the whole afikra team. Thank you for the wonderful questions. And of course, I mean, as I said in the beginning, I'll close again. Thank you to you, Youssef.
Thank you, Malik. Really good.
It was an absolute pleasure reading your work, and engaging with it, and then having this chance to have a public conversation with you. It was really meant a lot to me. So thank you.
Thanks.